Services Department here at Alzheimer Group, AGI. And welcome to our September webinar. This monthly webinar series is made possible by the Lindsay Foundation and AGI's Laszlo Learning Center. This month, we have the pleasure of welcoming Tamara Sussman. She is a professor and PhD program director at the School of Social Work at McGill University. Dr. Sussman's interdisciplinary community-engaged program of research focuses on enhancing the aging experiences of older persons with health-related challenges and exposing older persons at heightened risk of marginalization when interfacing with health services. Her research program is drawn from over a decade of clinical work with adults and families managing health-related issues. Her recent projects have sought to improve the relocation experiences of older persons and their families, strengthen palliative approaches to care in long-term, support inclusive housing programs for older homeless persons, and center persons living with dementia in their own care planning. So we're really excited to have you here. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know how it works. We can't see you, but you are welcome to ask questions throughout, as you think of them throughout the lecture. We're going to get to the questions at the end. In the webinar format on Zoom, the chat box is disabled. So on the bottom of your screen, next to the box that says chat, you'll see a box that's called Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A box because that's the ones that we can see. Okay, so don't use the chat box, use the Q&A box. I'll collect the questions and I'll ask Dr. Sussman the questions at the end of the lecture. Okay, so welcome. We're looking forward to this, and I'm going to give you the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen, for that fulsome introduction. And absolutely, I've been working on many issues around aging and health for about 17 years, but in the recent past, I have been doing quite a bit of work on this idea of advanced care planning and how to improve people's access to it. All sorts of people, but particularly people with dementia and their families, because this can be a really helpful tool in thinking about planning ahead for care. So what I'm going to do today is offer a background of at least my understanding of advanced care planning, because the term is used a lot and people use it in different ways. So just so that we all are speaking the same language. And then I'm going to offer some findings from myriad of studies that I've done on advanced care planning with people with dementia, and specifically their family members, service providers, and with older adults more generally. And also I'm going to hone in on some recent work I did on using particular workbooks and how those might help with advanced care planning conversations. And as Karen said, there will be a discussion and questions element as well, and I certainly welcome those. I will try my best to answer them. So what is advanced care planning? Advanced care planning is really the process of thinking about, talking about, and if desired, also documenting one's preferences and values for wishes for future care that includes end-of-life care. So advanced care planning is basically talking in advance about what things people may want to see happen down the line to the best of their abilities. It's not about making in the moment and predetermined medical decisions. It's really more open than that, talking about values and how that may play into what you would want in your future, including end-of-life care. It also includes allocating a legal decision maker, which in Quebec we talk about mandates, and allocating somebody to be that person to speak with you and if required for you in particular instances. And unfortunately, all too often we allocate that person, but we don't prepare them with the information that they may need to help make decisions that would really center what we would have wanted. And it's really more than just discussion about wills and funerals and specific medical decisions like I'm not going to want a feeding tube at this stage. It's really much more open than that. So when you ask people if they've done advanced care planning, they may say, oh yes, I have my will. So they've planned for a funeral, but sort of, have you talked more generally about your care? You'll learn that many people will say, oh, I haven't really thought about doing that. So what are the benefits of engaging in advanced care planning with persons living with dementia and their families? This is a tool, it's a way of empowering people with dementia to be at the center of their care planning. It's really about getting them to talk about what it is that is important to them now and also in the future. And that can also be helpful to caregivers in directing decisions down the line. If you remember having a conversation with somebody about some of the key values they have, then you can use that information to think about what decision you may make in the moment if you're not able to consult them in the same way. So it's been shown to really help family members feel a little bit more confident. What are some of the challenges? Lots of confusion about, yeah, I think it's really important to talk about, but I don't know exactly what I should be talking about. And this is even more so for people with dementia, because advanced care planning was really developed as a way of talking about kind of very end of life care. And for people with dementia, there's a lot more future care planning that seems to also be important around what happens if I'm no longer able to direct care myself. And those kinds of conversations, people are just a little confused about what to talk about. There's certainly a fear of doing more harm than good. I know from many focus groups with older people with dementia, they will tell you that speaking about deterioration and what will happen if I can no longer recognize people who I love, those things are harder to think about and talk about for them than death itself. So advanced care planning is a hard conversation, and a lot of family members and service providers don't want to introduce it because they don't want to induce hardship on people with dementia. People with dementia will often, especially with very good family support, which many people have the opportunity to have, will say, I don't really need to talk about this because my family just kind of knows what it is that I'm going to need and want. And so then you ask the person, the family, and that burdens them a lot. Well, I think, but maybe I'm not sure that I know. I wouldn't mind having a bit of a conversation about this. So that can sometimes get in the way. And of course, everybody's sort of wondering, when should we have this conversation? You'll have people say, oh, the earlier the better. You'll have other people say, well, I'm fine now, so why do I really need to have this conversation now? So there's a lot of uncertainty about when to bring up advanced care planning and what timing is the right timing. So in terms of what to discuss, and again, I'm going to get into a particular workbook, and I think workbooks are great because they really offer you a recipe of the kind of questions to ask. But more generally, the things that people have found that open up conversations about future care is kind of what if you get to a point where you're not really able to put your clothes on your own. Like, what if that happens? What would some things be that would be important to you in that circumstance? So you sort of give what if scenarios. You can also talk about other people, observations about other people's care. You know, who do you know that you think had good care when they needed a lot more help in their lives? And what made it good? What do you think was good about it? Or who do you know that had bad care and what made it bad? What are the things that are most meaningful to you? that really gets into personal values that matter both in the moment and down the line. A lot of people will say, you know, my independence is highly important to me. So what does that look like when your independence is threatened, and what decisions will I make around balancing independence with another value, you know? So really understanding what makes life meaningful for people. What are the 3 most important things you want me to know about your preferences for future care? If you can think of 3 things, what would they be? What are the things you're most concerned about? So those kinds of sort of open questions can start to open up spaces for people to talk a little bit more broadly about future care, and have been found to be things that people are willing to start talking about and start engaging in conversations about. In terms of the fear of harm, I've been told this a lot, and I've seen it in action in a lot of my research studies. You really can't know until you try. So some people surprise you, and right away you talk about what advanced care planning is, and they are ready to answer your questions and to kind of go for it. And other people, you know, will kind of avoid or will tell you, I don't really need to do that now. And, you know, I will also offer you some strategies around how to navigate that. But people are very good at protecting themselves from conversations that they're not ready to have. So you can only really know by trying, and just presuming it's not going to be good and it's going to be harmful is one way of ensuring that it doesn't happen. So that's kind of one message to think about. And of course, and interestingly, this has come up a ton in a lot of focus groups that I've done with people with dementia, who will say their families just know. And what I have found to be an interesting and useful tool sometimes is to help people with dementia understand that this sometimes puts a lot of pressure on families, and they can show their care, they can unburden their family members by actually articulating what it is that is important to them. So it reverses this fear that we all have of being a burden, by saying, you know what, if you actually take some time to share what it is that you think, and it may be hard for you to do, this is really going to help people. This is really going to help people feel a little less burden if they do have to make certain decisions on your behalf. And it's also a way of resolving disagreements, because different people in your family presumed you wanted one thing or another. So that strategy can sometimes help people overcome the barrier of, well, my family just knows, I don't need to talk about it. So now getting into a little bit more specifically the notion of using tools and workbooks to support advanced care plan. So I've done quite a few studies now on looking at working books and how they may be acceptable for people with dementia and their families, what conditions encourage people to use them, and how we can use these workbooks to sort of improve access to advanced care planning of people with dementia. So I've done sort of a series of different studies around using workbooks with people with dementia, and I'm going to introduce some of them to you today. In doing this, I actually spent a lot of time looking at the different workbooks that exist. There are a lot of publicly available workbooks and kind of games and different sorts of things that are supposed to simulate advanced care planning. So I looked at a bunch of them, looked at the content of them, looked at what might be useful for people with dementia. And then from that, chose one in particular and looked a little bit more fully through focus groups at exploring would people actually find this useful? Is it harmful? Is it acceptable? And then I did another study where I distributed the workbook and looked at how people used it. So that's what I'm going to introduce to you today. In terms of workbook selection, in 2016, I did a huge web search on different advanced care planning tools. And I was looking specifically at things that are designed for self-use, because those things can be used by people with dementia and their families also on their own. I was looking at things that went beyond just helping people make medical decisions, because advanced care planning is a lot more than that. I was looking for things that included a component for decision makers that helped families kind of engage in these discussions, that gave them tips, and that included psychosocial content, like people's the importance of who people want to involve, this sort of the role that other interests play in people's desire for advanced care planning. So advanced care planning is often very medical, like, again, do you want a feeding tube? Do you want resuscitation? Those kinds of very specific medical decisions are one very small component of a whole larger conversation about what is good care for people. So I wanted to make sure these workbooks and tools that I was using were a bit more expansive. So I actually found 3 different tools, and I have them all on slides, and I encourage you to look at them yourselves and see if any one of them is more interesting than the one I'm going to present. A Go Wish card game, the Speak Up workbooks that were developed by the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, and they have ones for particular provinces. And the one that I settled on was the Conversation Starter Kit. And I did that in particular because it was the only tool that had a dementia specific version for family members. So it was the only tool that sort of had some specialized thought placed on what the particular circumstances of people with dementia may be, and to help families navigate those conversations. So the Go Wish card game, just to show it to you, is basically you can play it online or look at it online, and it's a series of cards that get you, you use a prompting question. Like, this one was designed a lot more for end of life, I would say, which is why I decided not to use it for people with dementia in particular, because that future care was a small part of what they wanted to talk about. But the idea is that you say to people, if you were to be in a circumstance where you were close to the end of life, or where you, needed a lot of care, how important would it be for you to have family with you? And people kind of, put things in stacks of very important, somewhat important, and not important. And from those stacks, you can have more specific conversation. Okay, you said this was important. Tell me more about that. What does it mean to have family with you? Who in your family would you want with you? What kinds of things would you hope that they know or do? So you can kind of refine your conversation based on the things that people have suggested are very important. So the Speak Up workbooks, I'd say, are quite similar to the Conversation Starter Kits. They have information about advanced care planning, some of it specific to a province. They have reflective questions. They have open questions, and they kind of just get people thinking and talking about advanced care. But I still find them to be a little bit more medically focused. So that's why I didn't particularly choose them for the studies that I did, but they're definitely worth looking up and publicly available, and they're should be, I'm quite sure, Quebec-based version there. And the reason why that's important is sometimes you'll see at the end of these things different statements about the laws that are not true for the province in which you exist. So it's really important when you're using tools to understand which jurisdiction, and if there's anything that talks about law, make sure that it is relevant for the jurisdiction in which you're working. So the conversation starter, it used to be called Kit, now it's called Guide. As I said, it has a version for people who are living with health conditions to fill themselves, and it has a version for caregivers of people with dementia and Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And that helps people with sort of little tips of what you might say to prompt different conversations. And like a lot of other workbooks, it's sort of designed as a, steps. First, you think about what matters to you, then you plan to talk, then you talk, and then you keep talking. So it sort of helps people get into a space of getting in touch with what they might want and preparing and getting the confidence to talk and then actually having the conversation. So, here are some examples from the guide that you would see. Things that getting people to think about what's important to them. What does a good day look like for you? What or who supports you during times of difficulty? What matters to me through the end of my life is, so these are very similar to kind of some of those questions that I offered you at the beginning, just to get people talking about some of their values around future care and end of life care. It also has a section on rank that gets people to actually rank things. So, some questions and examples of that are here. If you weren't able to speak for yourself, who would you want people to follow all of your wishes, or do you want them to do what they think is best in the moment? So you can have a sense of how married people are to what it is they say right now versus how much they also would be open to people doing what would be comfortable to them in the moment. And that could be quite helpful actually to family members to know, because, people will say, my parents said to me, absolutely under no circumstances X. But then if they also said, but I also want you to consider yourself when you're making decisions, it can really help people navigate in the moment decisions. So these ranked kind of questions, as you'll see later on, are things that people have found particularly useful. People with dementia and also their families have found particularly useful to complete. So the first thing I did was I ran focus groups specific for people with dementia and specific for families, and a few joint ones because people asked for joint ones. And within those groups, I really asked people, here's the workbook. What do you think of it? When would you want to see something like this? How would you want it to be given to you? Sort of what circumstances, would encourage you to use this, and what advice would you have in terms of supporting its use? So the findings there were that really across the board, people viewed the workbooks as holding a lot of potential to take the stress away from families and to ensure that there's no guessing. So both people with dementia and family members actually had some quite positive reactions to the workbooks themselves as a way of alleviating burden and also clarifying what it is that people might want. People had varying opinions. They thought that the workbooks could be used right away as an initial advanced care planning engagement and conversation. And also, once people have had conversations, as sort of a booster to remind people. So they felt that they could be used in many different occasions. They saw them as really being useful to use kind of alone and then to come together, or to actually use together, so that even though they're designed to help people kind of think first and talk later, people found, well, you could think together and therefore you're thinking and talking. So they sort of had this opinion that they could be used both together and individually. And people were very drawn to the interactional components, the ranked questions, and particularly things that talked about how much individuals as with dementia want to be involved in decisions, because not everybody says that I want to know absolutely everything at all times. I'd like to be on a need to know basis, or at a certain point, I feel comfortable deferring to my family. People really appreciated the ranked questions that got them thinking about where they sat in terms of decisional involvement. So when I did the actual study where I distributed the materials, I was quite curious to see a little bit more about, is it true? Is the workbook as useful when it's used alone versus when it's used together? And, which elements of the workbook are seen as particularly useful for people? So basically, I enrolled about 18 people with dementia. It's a small kind of study, and some of whom had families who also enrolled, and some of whom who had no families. And when they enrolled with families, I met them together and asked them a little bit about advanced care planning together, and they received the workbook together. And when I enrolled them without families, of course, it was just the individual with dementia who received the workbook. So first of all, when the workbook was given, there really wasn't a ton of direction. It was really, we gave people a little bit of a survey just to get a sense of how much advanced care planning they'd already engaged with, just to gauge, is this really good as an intro? Do people already have to have thought a little bit about advanced care planning before they use the book? Then the book was left with them. We followed up in 2 weeks to see if they completed it. If they didn't, we gave them another 2 weeks. And in 1 month after, we presumed if they hadn't used it that they weren't going to, and we kind of did a post completion visit to understand a little bit further about why people might not have used it if they didn't, and also to do an advanced care planning engagement survey again to see if anything shifted in terms of people's sense of having engaged in the process. And we also left people with their workbooks, the ones who used them, but we copied them so that we could look a little bit more further at what it is people said in the workbooks themselves, like what parts of the workbook they used. So it was very clear that people were much more likely to use the workbook together than they were to use it alone. The people who enrolled with families, where the families were there when the workbook was given, were much more likely, highly more likely to use those workbooks. So this notion of if you can, having both the person with dementia and the family member there and sort of talking about the workbook and giving it to them together seems to be a useful way to encourage engagement. It was also clear that had people thought a little bit about advanced care planning, like who their decision makers should be, and that, yeah, maybe talking to health providers about some of the situations that may compromise my health, that I would want them to know what I would want to do. Like they hadn't done it, but they'd thought about the possibility of it. They were more likely to use the workbook. So it kind of also spoke to the fact of having a little bit more of a conversation to get people primed may support the workbook use. It was also interesting that the ranked questions and the open-ended questions that really got people writing and thinking were by far, were really used. So the people appreciated the interactive elements of the workbook, and all people were very able to be clear about how much information they wanted or didn't want down the line. So that was a really useful ranking question. And most people were also clear about their preferences for sharing information, like how much they would want others in their family and who those people they would want to be told about certain things. So that sort of notion of information sharing was really helpful in unpacking people's preferences. There was one question that asked people, are you concerned about having too much or too little care? And a lot of people put their answer in the middle. So when people put their answer in the middle, it doesn't really clarify what they're concerned about. And I think part of the problem is that the question asks for two things. It asks, people might be both concerned about having too much care and concerned about having too little care. So you sort of, you're double, it's called double barreling. The question probably needs to be broken down, but it also seems that people need a little to talk a little bit more about what they mean, or what that means to them, like the concern for that. And people also seem to need a little bit more prompting. Like a lot more people said that they were unsure about the level of shared decision-making they wanted, like how much they wanted families to make decisions on their behalf or health providers to make decisions, and how much they wanted to be involved. So, you know, when you see a scale and someone has, yes, very much agree, yes, very much disagree, that tells you what people want. But when they're in the middle, you don't really always know what to do with that. So you probably have to ask more about what led you to put yourself here in the middle. Tell me more about that. It's sort of a launch pad for a conversation. And the open questions really yielded some important insights. Like, you know, here's an example. One person said, you know, they're talking specifically about the end of life, or if they're no longer able to communicate. You know, if there was a volunteer who could play violin, I'd really appreciate hearing that. Like that kind of thing soothes me and calms me. So it just gives people opportunities to talk about the kinds of unique things about them that they could perceive as being useful for themselves or to improve their quality of life if things kind of change for them in terms of their function. So as I mentioned, people who with dementia who reported on their experiences using the workbook had some quite positive things to say. I feel good about the whole process and my thinking. I really feel that my whole family has understood my wishes now and agree with my wishes. So there was a sense of reassurance that the process was helpful. So as I kind of alluded to when I spoke about the way people use the workbook, it seems that if you're going to be thinking about using a workbook like this as a way of stimulating an advanced care conversation, it seems that distributing it with people with dementia and a family member together may be a way of ensuring its use and also getting a bit more of a conversation going. It also seems that the ranked questions can elicit really important information, but they can also provide opportunities for which things you can probe further. Because if you as a service provider, you're providing a workbook, or you as a family member ask your family member to complete a workbook, and you see kind of in the middle responses, you also know those are the areas that maybe you have to talk about a little bit more to understand them a little bit more. And also it seems that some level of engagement with advanced care planning, like, have you thought a little bit about who you'd want to speak on your behalf if you weren't able to completely speak on your behalf? Have you thought a little bit about, do you find it important? Have you thought about the need to speak to health providers? So some educational and sort of initial reflections that does seem to prime people a little bit more to use the workbooks, to have had a little, it's not a great way to provide education and to encourage people who've never thought about advanced care planning before. So some form of a prime may be something that's useful. And the advanced care planning engagement survey that we used could almost be, if you were thinking about who to give a workbook to or who to have a bit more of a conversation with, you could almost imagine asking a few questions from that survey. And it's something that I'm happy to ensure gets distributed to anyone here along with the workbooks. You could imagine that might be a good way of deciding maybe who you're giving a workbook to or who you're having more of a conversation with and engaging in advanced care planning conversations first. So, I mean, in conclusion, it's never the case for everybody. And there's always complicated situations. And there's always people who, despite your best efforts, are not or refusing or unable to have this kind of a conversation. But seemingly from a lot of the different groups that I have run and focus groups and the study on distribution, advanced care planning is acceptable to many people with dementia. And workbooks do seem to help expand people's thinking about what they should be talking about and also support these discussions. And discussions about decisional involvement, like how involved people want to be in decisions in relation to their care, seems to be of particular importance to people with dementia. So, and not everybody will say, I need to know everything all the time, but some people will. So, you know, understanding that also helps family members know how much effort and where to put their energies as they're working towards making decisions if they're in a position now that they have to make some of those decisions or take the lead. And it really seems that, you know, it's all of our responsibilities as professionals in community organizations, in hospital settings, in home care settings, to offer opportunities to support these discussions. And it's possible that these form of workbooks may be an avenue for that. But just simply giving them without kind of any follow-up discussion or with any thought about who you're giving them to may not be the most effective for everybody. So really thinking about that. I think the piece that's still complicated, and I have no doubt people who work in organizations like Alzheimer's Group, Inc. Are faced with this. What about the people that are having difficulty engaging advanced care planning and don't have families? And this is really where all of us as service providers are pretty important in first offering people just a foundational engagement and concern and a connection that does enable people to start to open up. And some of the ranked questions may be a place to start to help people unpack a little bit about what's important to them and who in their lives may be best positioned to help ensure those things happen. Without the strong support of families. So those are people that really we have to think a little bit harder on how to engage in advanced care planning, because they don't naturally have those advocates right beside them ready to speak on their behalf if that is a requirement. So I've included also a few paper references here that tell you a little bit more about some of the details of the focus groups that I ran and different reactions from service providers and people with dementia and the different sort of tools that I organized for future reference. But as I mentioned, I'm also happy to be sure that along with the presentation itself, that the guides or the starter kit is something that's available to you, and that the advanced care planning engagement survey, which might be interesting to some of you, is also available. And I will close by just saying that there is no one perfect tool, and there is no one perfect question. I think what you can get from workbooks is ideas that can help demystify and provide some direction for you to start engaging in these conversations. So, take them all with a grain of salt. They probably all have a question or two that you couldn't possibly imagine ever asking a particular person who you know, or if you are a person yourself who are trying to engage, not all the questions will be meaningful. But it seems that there's also a great opportunity here to open more up in terms of conversations about advanced care planning using some of these tools that are available to all of us and available for free. So, Karen, I think that kind of covers what I had prepared.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you. So we have a couple questions already. The first obvious question is, and I encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A. The first obvious question is, how can people get the workbook?
Yeah. So again, it's actually, I have the sites all embedded in the PDF. So if that can be distributed, I don't know if you have a way.
It absolutely can.
Slide.
So we can, yeah.
All of you will have the websites, but I will also send PDFs of the workbooks, that the ones that I used, because I adapted them to Quebec, and they're not so readily available on the websites, and everybody is free to have those.
Perfect. So what we'll do is we'll send it out to everybody who signed up for the, when you signed up, you gave us your email. So we'll send it out to everybody who signed up for the lecture.
Okay.
That's an easy answer. So another question we have is, does the workshop help family, or the workbook help families talk about medical assistance in dying?
So medical assistance in dying is obviously a huge issue that is kind of a changing target. I mean, at the time that I started this study, there was medical assistance in dying, or advanced medical directives were not legal for people with dementia. That the landscape of that is changing. What I think the workbooks help with is just in general understanding what's important to people in their care. And when you understand and feel confident that you've had conversations about what's important to people, you can advocate for things in a moment when they need you to advocate for those things. And I'll give you a really simple example. This is a very personal example from, my own life. When my dad saw me doing this stuff, he says, oh, maybe we should use some of these workbooks and kind of have a conversation about some of the things that are important. And, what I learned was probably in part what I already knew. My dad was a real cerebral person. Reading and watching things and thinking were quality of life for him. So when we ended up in palliative care and everybody and their uncle was really pushing for him to get up and get out of bed and sit, because that's considered to be, something that many people want, I was able to say, that's not quality of life for my dad. That was never important. And he's made it very specific, request for me that as long as he's still, reading and has access to those things, that's quality of care. So it arms you with the opportunity to sort of fight for things. And it also arms you with, well, if those things are important, if those things are less and less available, and I have to make a difficult decision, maybe I now understand what my dad would consider as quality and not quality. So that's really, I think it helps unburden a little bit, because you feel a little more connected to what it is that people value. And you can use that to make these really, really difficult decisions.
So one question I have with this workbook, I know that there's these questions to talk about and reflect. Is there also a place to write these things down in the workbook itself?
Yes.
Because that's something I find really helpful to families.
Yes.
Even sometimes when they have informal, like not guided conversations, sometimes the person will bring something up. I often suggest to care partners that they should write a journal and write those things down, because later on, it's hard to remember exactly what the person said. And it can be really helpful to give you confidence in making decision making when it's written.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, the answer is yes. That's the part that people seem to really use. Like, you know, list 3 things that are most important to you. And the conversation starter kit, what's kind of neat about it, if you choose to use it this way, is there's a family version and there's a version for people themselves who are living with any condition, dementia or otherwise. And you can kind of, you know, fill it out on behalf of, like, answer the questions in terms of what you think the person would say. And they sort of answer the questions in terms of what they say. And you can compare notes and realize where you're aligned and where you're actually surprised. And, you know, all of this stuff is recorded and written down, and you can use the workbook and use it again at a different period of time. So there's certainly space for writing things down. And I agree with you. I think that that's what people find the most. What I think is also important, that's why I distinguish an advanced medical directive from advanced care planning, is this is not an advanced decision. This is simply information about what's important to you that people can use when they're making decisions. Everybody,
right, because the reality is you're never going to think of every scenario that might come up, right?
you're
So
never
you
going to
need
think of
some
every scenario, and
priorities
you
for
may
ways.
change, and as life goes on and as things in your life change, you may also change your perspective. So it's important to understand that advanced care planning is best done when it's kind of ongoing. As circumstances shift, revisiting is a really good idea. But also for people not to feel burdened that just because I wrote it down means that, you know, something has to be
Set in stone
honored.
forever. Yeah,
Exactly.
because in life, priorities change sometimes, right?
Exactly.
So we have another question here. It's another medical aid in dying question. I'm not sure how far you want to go in that direction. But this question is, can you provide guidelines on how to prepare a person with dementia and their family to make the advanced request for medical assistance in dying that's now available as of October 30th? I think that we don't know enough yet, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's so many caveats to what's truly going to be available. But I will say that the most important piece of advanced care planning that should help families and people with dementia think about when and how, you know, they might want medical assistance in dying is just these very questions about what makes life valuable for you, and how might somebody notice if you're suffering, and how might somebody pick up that life isn't as much of a quality for you anymore. Like, what kinds of how do you show that? What does that mean to you? So I think that advanced care planning has always been meant to just encourage ongoing conversations around really hard topics that will always be helpful when you're faced with a situation. So you're never going to anticipate the exact moment. But if you remember and can draw from those conversations, it can be very reassuring.
I do want to acknowledge, I know that people are asking for concrete information about the medical assistant, the medical assistance in dying laws and how they're changing. It's not the focus of today's webinar. I will say that we will do our best once the new law is in effect, because it's been shifting sands, I know, for the last couple of years. We will do our best to find somebody to come and speak with us who is an expert in that area, but we may have to wait a little bit longer because, you know, we have to know what is going to be in the law and what exactly is happening. You know, we can't get into the nitty gritty because we just don't know yet. And so this is a bit of a broader and more general topic about advanced care planning, as opposed to specifically the medical assistance in dying law.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Very fair, but I think also to sort of demystify, you know, the truth is that people with dementia and families have been making very difficult decisions around care amidst uncertainty since the beginning of time. So that is one really difficult decision because there's such finitude to it. But there are a myriad of other very difficult decisions that the two parties make. And I think that what we have found is that avoiding thinking about those scenarios generates stress most of the time for both people with dementia and family members. And you don't even, family members will sometimes say, but my family member doesn't even acknowledge they have dementia. So how can I? You don't even have to acknowledge you have something. You can say, listen, anything could happen to either one of us at any time. I want to talk about what happens if one of us gets really sick. Like what our concerns,
Yeah, and I think we're talking about two different related things here, right? There's the bigger picture questions, which is what the tool like the conversation starter kit can really help with. That bigger picture of what's this person's basic life philosophies here? What do they want for their future? What are their priorities? What's important to them? What do they value? Which can help you make decisions together about specific things like medical aid and dying, or where the person might want to be living, and what you can, uh, prioritize in terms of when you're advocating for care, because sometimes we have to choose between difficult things, right? So these are bigger picture conversations as opposed to specific topic conversations, I think is kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well said, Karen. That's a great way.
I have a couple questions. One, oh, I see. And you know what? I'm sorry. I see that there's more questions here. I didn't realize that they wouldn't kind of scroll automatically. So I'm going to go through these, and then if we have time at the end, I'll ask you mine. One here is, how do you approach the topic when you know the individual is not always receptive?
Yeah. So a few things. I mean, you can say, this is something that's important for all of us to do. So you can start by actually saying, you might not want to talk about what it's important to you, but I want you to know in case something happens to me, what's important to me. So you can start the conversation by doing the hard work and sharing your own thoughts. And the other aspect is, that notion of you are helping me by telling me these things. I'm not doing this for you. I'm asking you to do this for me. Sometimes that because it flips the narrative. People are so worried about being burdens, and so they don't want to think about their own deterioration. But if you remind people that this is how they can show care to you by sharing these kinds of things, people are sometimes receptive to that. And again, I do think the strategy of talking about other people can sometimes also help. It gets depersonalized. So those questions at the beginning about like, what did you think of the care so-and-so got? Did you think it was good? Did you think it wasn't good? That can sometimes help. It's less threatening. It's not about the person, but it really is about the person. Because what they think was good is about what they think is good. And those are kind of some tricks that can sometimes be helpful.
And you don't have to tackle everything all at the same time, all on the same day, right? Because sometimes it's going well until it isn't, because the person is taxed and they can't or don't want to talk about this for as long as you might want to talk about it too, right?
Exactly.
So one question that I have is, did your research show anything about timing of this? Like, is there a point where it gets really difficult to start having these conversations? One of the thoughts that I had while you were talking was those people who have those in the middle responses. My question was, I wonder how many of those people who are just kind of, I don't know, put me somewhere in the middle, may be doing that because it's difficult to process and understand the question being asked. And so in the middle might be a safe response. I don't know. I'm just, or, verbal skills, like, does that really get in the way are there any kind of tools within the workbook that can help people, who have limited verbal capacity, maybe somebody with aphasia, who maybe can understand the question but can't necessarily articulate their responses? There are ways around that?
Yeah, so I would say the workbook that's designed for people to fill out themselves wouldn't be very good for that. The family handbook may be better because it sort of gets the like, even if you need to, of course, it also still encourages conversations, but it also asks you to remember conversations you've had or to notice things that you've seen recently and help unpack what that could mean. So I'd say that's where the family handbook may be useful. Definitely there's a level of communication that is still presumed by using the workbook. But I think your point about what the middle means is just, perfectly bang on. That's what I was left with. Well, obviously we still need some follow-up conversations because middle could mean a million things.
Right.
And that gives you some direction about, okay, the person's really sure about this, but they're in the middle, as you said. Is it too hard to know? So what would give them more clarity to help them know a little bit more? And or is it, is it something else? Is that, is it really not that important to them, right?
Right. The middle could really be just, I'm in the middle, or I don't, or it's okay with me either way, or it could mean I really don't know what you're asking here.
Yeah.
So we do have a suggestion that you develop a workbook for medical assistance in dying conversations. So if you're if you're wanting a direction. So we're kind of coming to the end, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what comes next in your research, because I know that you're working on a new research project.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Karen. So, of course, advanced care planning is important and it remains important to me. But, the thing that always troubled me about advanced care planning is that you wouldn't want to use it as a way of excluding people too early from in the moment conversation. So there's always space. And in fact, in sort of recent changes in Quebec, it's really important for us to be a support people in making in the moment decisions to the best of their ability. So really the next project that I'm working on is, how do you support people to make in the moment decisions when they maybe can't communicate in the way that they were able to communicate? What decisions are most important to people with dementia and family members? And so I'm really excited to be starting that project. If anyone's interested in learning any more about it, feel free to email me directly. Karen can offer that information to all of you, because I think that's really important. And quite honestly, may elicit some important information about medical aid in dying. Like if that is an important decision, how do you ensure supporting people to make that decision together, even when it seems that an individual may not be able to articulate themselves? So yeah, I'm really excited about
That's great. So it's taking this decision-making focus and broadening it to life decisions as opposed to specifically end of life planning.
Exactly. And also to ensure that people don't exclude individuals with dementia too early on. How do we make efforts to continue to include people in decisions that they value as important? Because not everybody needs to be included in every decision.
Right. And how do we prioritize which things the person is included in? That's great.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much. We're at the end of our hour already. It went by really, really fast. If anybody thinks of any questions afterwards, you can, of course, email them to us. And we will also make sure that everybody gets the link to the workbook as well. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.